Welcome back to 10 of the best. I'd previously listed 10 of the best DOS games not available digitally. But what about Windows games from the same period? Well, it turns out that unlike DOS, lots of good Windows titles from the late 90s are available digitally. But lots does not mean all. And there's hundreds of great titles that this list will happily omit. Here are 10 of the best. Let's go! Number 10. Discworld Noir. Unsurprisingly, I kick off my list with a game from the same series as my last list. Terry Pratchett's Discworld series often held up a satirical lens to both modern and historical events, by superimposing them into its comic world. This happened to the likes of cinema, rock music, the Industrial Revolution, and the free press. Discworld Noir is a 1999 adventure game that I can't pronounce that does just that. But the subject of its humour is film noir mysteries and H.P. Lovecraft, with its protagonist Newton being the only private investigator in all of Ankh-Morpork. A private investigator in a fantasy world written around the turn of a millennium? Nah, that idea would never work. Pratchett himself is credited on this title as having caused far too much interference. What this means to the layman is that the dialogue is sharp and witty, and when coupled with a dark and gloomy portrayal of the previously bright and colourful Discworld, you're in for a fantastic bit of sleuthing. As many players subsequently discovered, ranking Noir as the best Discworld game and one of the finest adventures ever made. Number 9. Simtar. The Sim series these days is known the world over, with a small portion of that group vaguely aware that something called Sim City existed. But to the more knowledgeable on the matter, there were any number of Sim games released in the 90s, and not always by Maxis. Simtar is one of these. Created by Japanese developer Ute Saito of OpenBook, you're in charge of building a vertical empire in the burgeoning domain of the skyscraper. You lease parts of a skyscraper out to tenants by constructing restaurants, offices, hotel rooms, and the like. To keep the little sim people happy, you have to construct medical centers and parking lots and make sure everything is effective, including the elevator systems. Especially the elevator systems. If people get too stressed, then you might lose their custom altogether. It's a slow-paced strategy with an intriguing graphical cross-section of the building to operate within, and if you're on top of things, it can be quite like SimCity, in that you can sit back and relax and watch as everything flourishes. Number 8. Heretic II. Heretic and Hexen are easily obtainable these days thanks to a combination of licensing agreements and DOSBox. Even Hexen 2 is available, but there's no sign of Heretic 2 on digital distribution sites, because the rights are owned by Activision, not id Software or Raven. You return as Corvus, but this time most of the game is spent in third person, a new addition to the series, essentially aping the Tomb Raider series but with a much darker fantasy tone. Heretic 2 is a pretty good game, but it's what it represents to me that's more important. There's this huge swath of late 90s 3D accelerated games that for some reason or other just aren't available anymore. A few widescreen updates here and texture packs there, and they'd be a welcome addition to many people's game libraries. But sadly, due to company bickering, they'd rather cut their noses off to spite their faces. Number 7. Myth: The Fallen Lords. Before Bungie began development on the game that would spawn the Halo franchise, they decided to produce a real-time tactics title set in a fantasy world. Myth: The Fallen Lords has you take to a 3D battlefield to duke it out with a set group of units. No training up of replacements here, it's all about your effective usage of the forces you have, with the terrain affecting their performance, and an almost gleeful approach to showing blood and the true carnage of a battlefield. Clearly, Microsoft were impressed, because they bought out the company and Myth would have gone the way of Myth, but for a dedicated group of fans who kept it alive through the years and subsequent Microsoft operating systems. While real-time tactics as a genre was never that popular, it's bizarre that Bungie LLC can't re-release the games of the original Bungie. Myth swept the awards for Best Strategy Game of the Year, produced a sequel, and can be played in the engine of that sequel using the Fallen Levels plugin by Project Magma. It's just a shame that once again it has fallen to the fans to do what the developers legally cannot. Number 6. Mech Commander. Another great strategy game lost to time due to coming down with a bad case of the BattleTech license, which has been passed around a few publishers over the years. Infocom, Activision, Microprose, Hasbro, Microsoft, Majesco, Eidos, Persona, Piranha, Paradox. This has resulted in a hideous legal minefield that prevents many classic games from ever being re-released again. Mech Commander has you controlling a group of mechs across an isometric landscape, achieving the usual series of objectives. The gameplay is similar in a sense to Total Annihilation, but because it's a real-time tactics game, you have to make sure your limited group is kitted out with the appropriate arsenal of weaponry. Sort of like Syndicate, with giant robots and vehicles instead of cyborgs. Unfortunately, it came out in 1998, which was a death sentence to any strategy game not called StarCraft or Alpha Centauri. A real shame, as there's a lot to like here, and it will likely never see a re-release. Number 5. Star Trek: Birth of the Federation. With many of the great Star Trek games of the past finally seeing digital release, it beggars belief that all the games developed by legendary Microprose, yes, them again, could have possibly been overlooked. Alongside Generations, which was a fun but flawed shooter, and Klingon Honor Guard, which was a fun but flawed was the game that many Trek fans had been waiting for decades to appear. Birth of the Federation is a text-heavy but colourful turn-based 4X strategy. That is exactly the kind of complex and pedestrian title that fits the next generation license. Its LCARS-inspired interface is very 90s, but if micromanagement is your thing, then this game scratches that itch wonderfully, much like how Star Wars Rebellion did for fans of that science fiction franchise. A rushed release meant that it was uncharacteristically buggy in the final product, but this got patched up, and just like with many other games that didn't see a digital re-release, Birth of the Federation got modifications for widescreen support and many other quality of life improvements from the community. Oh, and it had 3D space battles using the Falcon 4.0 engine. Speaking of which, number 4. Super EF 2000. Falcon 4.0 is on digital platforms, as are the likes of IL-2 Sturmo, that game, and Red Baron, but Super EF 2000 isn't. The original EF 2000 was technically a DOS game, but its Windows-only re-release was the one with the hardware acceleration support. More importantly, at the time it was regarded as one of the greatest games ever made, so you'd think for the sake of nostalgia, Atari would thumb their way through their rights catalogue and put it up on digital distribution, right? Well, no, because flight is one area of the simulation genre where the march of technology doesn't hold many drawbacks. After all, when you've experienced the likes of DCS World in virtual reality, what possible reason could you have to go back to the limited flight engines of the past? Yesterday's plane sim may be outdated as soon as the next one appears, but there's a dedicated group of flight enthusiasts who simply enjoy the style or setting or plot, or even the graphics of older flight sims when compared to their ultra-realistic and soulless modern replacements. Why not cater to them? Did the likes of F-19, Stealth Fighter and B-17 Flying Fortress really sell so poorly that companies decided against it? Number 3. The Neverhood. The Neverhood, Incorporated, was a splinter studio that formed out of Shiny Entertainment, a developer with a fantastic pedigree for bizarre but brilliant games. This was no different. Just look at it. It was completely unique at the time. There were no graphics, but claymation models using the same techniques as Aardman animation, except they adopted a surrealist style. These were captured using digital SLR cameras in 1995. Technical wonders and design creativity are all very well and good for art students, but what about the story? You are Claymen, traversing the deserted Neverhood, which itself is suspended above an endless void. You must find your way to Clog's castle. What do you mean that synopsis was short? Go consult the Hall of Records if you really want more background information. Now fully capable of running on ScumVM, there's no reason for Pencil Test Studios not to gather up the old band, hire a good lawyer, and have some conversations with Microsoft and DreamWorks, especially after what happened with Armicrog. Oh dear. Number 2. Your favourite sports game. Whether you're racing along tarmac or towards a touchline or approaching a goal mouth, chances are you'll be doing so with a copious amount of advertisement and licensing either slapped on you or zooming past you. Therein lies the problem for most of your sports titles on PC. Or at least that's what companies will tell you. Many of them have an irritating habit of immediately consigning a previous entry in the series to the scrap heap after releasing a slightly altered version of the same work. For full price, of course. This has become an increasingly glaring issue in modern times because it turns out that there are more recent iterations that aren't as good as the previous ones. But you can't purchase the original previous works online now, and all network options have been shut down, so you have to move on to the next new thing if you fancy a multiplayer. For all their graphical fidelity, a large chunk of modern sports titles are in a sad state due to lack of competition, since only a handful of companies can afford the exorbitant licensing costs in the first place. The result is hundreds of classic games from the past that either cannot legally be sold without renegotiating appearance fees and licensing and advertising agreements, or games that were endorsed or heavily featured athletes who have since been disgraced in the public eye. Personally, I'd love to see unlicensed spiritual successors to Championship Manager 2001-2 and Pro Evolution Soccer 5, two very different football games that captured my attention for thousands of hours. Number 1. Civilization 2. This game was consistently ranked in the top 5 of all time by PC Gamer, usually in the number 1 or number 2 spot, until the release of Civilization 4 in 2005, almost a decade later, which is like 100 years in gaming time if you come out in the 90s for Windows 3.1. There are still people around today who will tell you that Civilization 2 is better than anything that came after. I might just be one of those people too, since I sunk more hours into Civ 2 than any of the others in the series. If you've been living under a rock, Civilization is the best-selling 4X strategy game series, where you take a nation from early obscurity all the way through to space-age exploration. Developed by Microprose, yes, them again, in 1996, it still has articles written about it in modern game publications, over 25 years out from its release. So the question needs to be asked, what are Firaxis doing? Why haven't they re-released it? Are they worried it will make their modern Civ games look bad? Because it will. Have they somehow forgotten that it exists? Unlikely. Does Brian Reynolds simply refuse to have it put up somewhere convenient? Who can tell? And if you enjoyed me rambling on about 10 of the best games from the 90s that weren't running on DOS, I have hundreds of videos on my channel. Feel free to take a look. And if you like what you see, you can always hit subscribe. Until next time.